We will now give the floor to the representative of Syria.
Can you imagine seeing 50,000 terrorists going to Manchester, wreaking havoc? And we would call them moderate British armed opposition. Can you imagine that? And then the OCHA would deliver humanitarian aid for them to stay alive in Manchester. Can you imagine that? This is absurd. This would be absurd. Madam President, it is truly ironic that many of the member states of this organization are now facing an unprecedented challenge, namely that the presidency of the Council is playing the role of adversary and arbiter at the same time. Yesterday, you forced a discussion on Nicaragua onto the agenda of the Security Council, although the situation there does not constitute a threat to international peace and security. And today, you're forcing a discussion on Idlib. Tomorrow, it will be Venezuela's turn, and then it will be Iran, as we've understood from the program of work of this month. This state of bitter hostility that you've created against us over the past decades has never been our choice. We are one of the founding members of the United Nations. We believe in peace and we've spared humanity the scourge of war. It has become common practice that the three Western countries' permanent members of the Security Council would use their presidency of the Council to rally others against my country, against my government, through holding hundreds of meetings, through sounding the alarm, leveling accusations against us, using menacing language. Whenever the Syrian Arab Army and its allies made progress in countering armed terrorist groups, tools that are used by those Western countries. For the thousandth time, we stress from this rostrum that the governments of these three Western countries and their operatives in the region are the main reason for the suffering of the Syrian people. In Syria and beyond, they're fueling the conflict. They're doing their utmost to perpetuate this conflict through investing in Takfiri terrorism, Wahhabi terrorism, Saudi terrorism that was invented in the 80s of the past century. Their intelligence service came up with the most creative names. The Caliphate, the Army of Islam, the Soldiers of Islam, Al-Nusra Front, the Islamic Turkmen Army, Nuruddin az-Zenki. By the way, these names have nothing to do with Syria. Absolutely nothing to do with Syria. And they used these groups as a tool in their foreign policy to get back at countries that reject their diktats. Any action made by the Syrian government to expel terrorist organizations from the Syrian government of Idlib. Idlib is a Syrian province. It's not in Somalia, just for your geographic information. Any action taken to expel those terrorist groups is a legitimate sovereign right according to international law, the UN Charter, and Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism, in addition to the understandings of Astana. Such action would be in response to the demands of millions of Syrians, including people living in Idlib, that are besieged by terrorist organizations. We receive everyday notifications from people living in Idlib asking us to liberate them from terrorism. No country and no entity has the right to curtail this sovereign right or to trade with the suffering of civilians in Idlib to dissuade the Syrian government from restoring security, stability, and normalcy in the Syrian province. Defending terrorist groups operating in Idlib and the surroundings is a desperate attempt to protect those groups, to prolong their expiry date, to recycle them and turn them into highly moderate armed groups in the other groups. Tomorrow we will see them operating in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Nigeria. We'll see them operating there. The Syrian state is the most committed to the safety of its people. This is why we announced that we give precedence to reconciliations, and we allowed plenty of time to armed groups in Idlib to lay down their arms, to become part of the reconciliation process, and to disassociate themselves from terrorist organizations not covered in the Astana process. In this regard, those who facilitated the entry of foreign terrorist fighters into my country, and the United Nations likes to call them non-state actors. I don't use the term terrorist, I use the term non-state actors. Also, His Excellency, the French ambassador, uses the word jihadists, not terrorists. He doesn't like this word. He uses the words jihadists. So those who facilitated the entry of foreign terrorist fighters in my country, especially the Turkish government, still have a chance to remove them from Idlib province, just as they did with the white helmets. They were removed in cooperation with Israel and Jordan before being redeployed once again to Idlib to commit another terrorist crime using chemical weapons. In case the armed terrorist groups refused to lay down weapons, refused to leave Syrian territory, to go back to where they came from, the Syrian government is prepared. We are cognizant of the humanitarian consequences that might result from liberating Idlib from Al-Nusra Front, a designated terrorist organization, and other affiliated terrorist groups that were not covered by the Astana process. This is why we take all precautions and preparations to protect civilians, to provide safe passages for them to leave, just as we've done before in similar situations. We would provide shelter, food, and medical care. The Syrian government also called upon international organizations operating in Syria, all of them, to prepare to meet urgent humanitarian needs. As we're talking about Al-Nusra Front, I would like to say that Ukraine, the US, the UK, and France remained for a whole year in this council, refusing our call to designate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, meaning Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, the terrorists who attacked New York. These countries refused to designate Al-Nusra Front on the Security Council lists. But a month ago, we heard that Washington approved the designation of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as an affiliate of Al-Nusra Front. It's not an affiliate. It is itself Al-Nusra Front. It is itself Al-Qaeda. The Syrian Arab Republic is committed to counter terrorism, to root it out, and to regain all Syrian territories and liberate it from terrorism and foreign occupations in all its forms and manifestations. Supporting Syria today is the true test to prove good intentions, compliance with international law and the Charter, and to prove credibility in the war against terrorism. We have provided to you information on the intent of terrorist organizations and white helmets to use chemical substances and to lay the blame at the feet of the Syrian government and to pave the way for another tripartite aggression. We call upon those three countries that have influence on the terrorist organizations on the ground to prevent them from using any weapons or chemical substances as a pretext to allow interference and direct aggression by their sponsors. Madam President, I convey to you the good news that investing in terrorism in my country has failed. Liberating Idlib from Al-Nusra Front and other terrorist organizations would be the last nail in its coffin. It would crush the hopes of those who invested billions of dollars in terrorism, whose cries have filled the halls of this organization, just as they did when the Syrian army was liberating the eastern neighborhoods of Aleppo, eastern Ghouta, Daraa, Quneitra, and rural Daraa. In conclusion, Madam President, I would like to make a remark to the colleague, Deputy Foreign Minister of Kuwait. I remind him that Mr. Tabatbati, who's a parliamentarian, a member of parliament in Kuwait, organized a campaign to send terrorists to Syria in 2012. This campaign was called Go and Fight for Jihad in Syria. I'm talking here about a member of parliament. Of course, he was supported by Takfiri Salafist members of parliament in Kuwait. Other Kuwaitis, such as Shafi al-Ajami, that we designated on the list of terrorists upon our request, although other members refused to do so for a number of reasons. So Shafi al-Ajami claims that he's a religious leader. He sends thousands of terrorists and so many funds to sponsor terrorism in Syria. There is a member of the army called Mutayri, member of the Kuwaiti army. According to the New York Times, in 2012, the New York Times issued a very long article on him. So a sergeant in the Kuwaiti army sent $500 million to sponsor terrorism in my country, according to a report by the New York Times. So this is what we've received from our brothers in Kuwait. I mean, Kuwait is calling us brothers, but I don't know what kind of brothers act this way. When we stood on Kuwait's side, we didn't send terrorists to Kuwait. We sent military forces to protect Kuwait. Thank you, Madam President.
There are no further speakers. The meeting is adjourned.